Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host Eleanor Goldfield along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad right now to be joined by Tamara Nassar, who is the associate editor and the producer of the weekly live stream at the Electronic Intifada. Tamara, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Eleanor.
So I wanted to start with something that you've written about and spoken about recently, which is what the Israeli occupation forces call Operation Iron Wall, which started on January 21st, just 2 days after the ceasefire went into effect, targeting specifically the city and refugee camp of Jenin in the West Bank, which, as you note in a recent article, has now extended to other areas of the West Bank, including Tulkarem and Tamun. And this offensive includes aerial bombing, violent military raids, sniper attacks, not least of all aimed at children, home demolition, and the detonation of entire blocks following the wiring of tens of buildings in residential areas. And at this point, we're looking at least 40,000 Palestinians forcibly displaced. So, Tamara, could you bring us up to speed here? We're recording this on Wednesday, February 12th, so listeners are aware that you're hearing this a bit after the fact. What is the situation in the West Bank right now?
So, as you note, Eleanor, this operation was launched days after the Gaza ceasefire the Israeli army in conjunction with the Shin Bet, Israel's police and domestic spy and assassination agency, as well as Israel's border police. This is one of the biggest Israeli assaults on the occupied West Bank since the Second Intifada 2 decades ago. It started in the city of Jenin and its refugee camp, but it has now extended into the Nur Shams refugee camp in the Tulkarem area, also in the northern occupied West Bank, as well as Tamun, which is south of Tubas in the Jordan Valley. The assault has been ongoing. There are currently about 50 Palestinians killed through this Israeli operation, as well as more than 100 injured. Israel imposed a total siege on the Jenin refugee camp. The UN agency UNRWA says that the Jenin refugee camp is almost emptied entirely of its residents, as well as other Palestinian refugee camps. This is an operation of mass displacement, forcible displacement. As you note, 40,000 Palestinians have been removed from their homes. The Israeli military is carrying out aerial bombardments in densely populated neighborhoods. The civilian infrastructure, the very basic infrastructure of electricity, water, sewage has been damaged and in many areas destroyed. This is a scale of destruction that is unprecedented in the past 20 years. There are some remaining Palestinian families in those areas, and they are at grave danger. There is no water, no electricity, other basic services are hindered. Israel has besieged hospitals in the Tulkarem area, as well as the main public hospital in the Jenin area, and destroyed all the roads leading to the hospital and around the camp, as well as some roads within the camp. And Israel started this operation as a form of its continuation of its genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. The right-wing coalition of Netanyahu's government has very strongly opposed the ceasefire that was negotiated and brokered by now US President Donald Trump in the days leading up to his inauguration. And as a way, and because they in large threatened to leave the Israeli government, the coalition which forms the Israeli government, the government had to kind of sell this or frame this massive onslaught onto the West Bank as a continuation of the war, in a way to save face for these right-wing ministers to stay in the coalition, because a lot of their base and their voters reside in those Jewish-only settlements surrounding those areas that are being invaded. Israel says that it's carrying out this assault in order to crush the armed resistance in the camps, which largely, even especially, emerge in areas that Israel continuously destroys and evidently do not surrender when Israel carries out these massive and very deadly onslaughts on those areas. And so what we're witnessing is the emptying of those refugee camps of their residents as Israel creates massive destruction in those places under the guise of targeting the armed resistance in the camps. And it hasn't slowed down or ceased as of yet.
And I'm curious too, because it seems like when the full-on genocidal onslaught was happening on Gaza, there was also violence happening in the West Bank, and it just didn't get as much information or it didn't get as much coverage in the alternative media. It got nothing in corporate media, but it didn't get as much coverage in the alternative media, of course, because the genocide in Gaza kind of took precedent. And would you say that what we're seeing now is indeed a ramp up even from what you were seeing during the genocide in Gaza? Or is it just kind of a continuation? And I mean, what specifically are they looking to do? Do they have some kind of plan outlined as opposed to just getting rid of militants, which is always what they say?
You're absolutely right in that this has been ongoing throughout Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, and in a scale also that has been on the rise. But it's also been happening even before. I mean, in the months leading up to October 7th, especially in the summer of 2023, Israel launched massive attacks on the Jenin refugee camp to crush the armed resistance there. And in many ways, I mean, this is what some Israeli analysts were saying in Israeli media, that this was one possible cause for the distraction of the Israeli military and their inability to respond well on October 7th, because their military was very focused on what was going on in the West Bank. The destruction was completely ramped up during the genocide, because while all eyes were rightfully on Gaza, Israel started launching these like days on end massive military assaults on refugee camps, where they started using this tactic of uprooting roads, which, I mean, maybe those words do not communicate just how destructive that is, but what they do is the Israeli troops start a ground invasion. They go into these camps, they station snipers across residential areas, they station themselves within Palestinian homes, and these bulldozers come into the camp and they bulldoze roads and the infrastructure beneath them, including sewage and electricity and water. And they do this under the guise of uprooting improvised explosive devices that Palestinian armed groups plant in order to detonate at a distance when Israeli troops drive over these specific roads. And while it does so under that guise, it's actually extremely destructive and is arguably a form of collective punishment on the camp residents. And military analysts have argued this doesn't really stop or curb Palestinian groups from planting these devices. In fact, it actually helps them do it because it uproots those roads and kind of creates these vacuums of areas where Palestinians can even more easily plant those explosive devices. And so this has been an ongoing trend before the genocide started, but kind of got so much worse. 2024 was one of the most destructive years for the West Bank. It's also witnessed some of the biggest expansion of Israeli settlements and outposts in the West Bank. Outposts are, I mean, all settlements in the occupied West Bank and the Golan Heights in East Jerusalem are illegal under international law, but there are these smaller, not legal even under Israeli law, outposts where settlers establish a certain camp, which Israel views as illegal, but then starts connecting to basic services and providing certain infrastructure for, and then puts them on the road for legalization. To put this in context, since the Oslo Accords were signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization in the 1990s, on average, Israeli settlers were building maybe 7 outposts per year. Last year alone, there were at least 59 Israeli outposts built throughout last year. And this is documented by the Israeli watchdog settlement group called Peace Now. So we are witnessing 2024 witnessed like a massive surge in Israeli settler violence against Palestinians, which forced many herding communities in the Jordan Valley to leave. This was accompanied with the Israeli military assaults on all of these refugee camps. And all throughout, Palestinians were trying to build a sort of resistance to this constant Israeli colonization and land theft in those areas. And this was getting very little coverage in the mainstream media. But it's also, I mean, you made a very good point that this is also a form of the continuation of the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza into the West Bank. And Israeli ministers have been largely open about it. I mean, Yisrael Katz, the Israeli defense minister, was calling very openly for similar tactics to be used, including the forcible displacement of Palestinians. He even framed the start of this operation on January 21st as drawing on the lessons. I'm paraphrasing, drawing on the lessons that the Israeli military learned in Gaza. And even some Israeli military analysts are saying that a lot of the soldiers that were deployed in Gaza and kind of have this genocidal approach into that they implemented in Gaza are coming into the West Bank, and commanders are having to slow them down. But that's not happening. And the Israeli army is even expanding its open fire policy towards these soldiers who are already trigger happy. So yes, Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq has been warning that the genocidal tactics that Israel used in Gaza are now being implemented in the West Bank. Last week, Israel carried out a massive bombing campaign in Jenin. And if you look at the footage and the pictures, it resembles Gaza skyline in the first week since October 7th. And these are scenes that are new to the West Bank. Someone who's 20 years old has probably never seen them. So it's very destructive. And what was normalized in Gaza by all of these mainstream media and politicians is now being implemented in the West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, when you were speaking, I recall reading Zamir, who's the new chief of staff to the Israeli army, has said that 2025 would be a quote year of war, which I guess unlike previous years. And I mean, and of course, Smotrich said that the West Bank would experience a Gaza-like fate. So to kind of echo what you were talking about, all these politicians in Israel's government have been very overt with their plans. I mean, what does this mean for the West Bank? I mean, what is the goal here? I mean, obviously the goal is ethnic cleansing and genocide, but specifically like why now? I mean, the West Bank has been, like you said, since the last Intifada, has been a place of, these outposts and continued violence by settlers and official Israeli military. Why specifically now to ramp up in this way?
That's a very good question. And I mean, it's important to understand it within the larger ideological direction that Israel is heading towards. So when we look at what's happened in Gaza, and even throughout Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, settlers and even Israeli ministers were publicly speaking about resettling the Gaza Strip. And maybe this was revived or reignited as an ambition after Trump's declaration that Gaza should be emptied of its residents and developed into a luxury Riviera or playground for the rich. And while, we don't know what's going to happen, or what Trump will be able to do, but to much more muted responses from the media and politicians, including the heads of Arab states, which are claiming to oppose Trump's comments, maybe not so much after in recent days, but Israel has already been accelerating its land theft in the occupied West Bank. And while Gaza is important, the West Bank has always been the primary focus for strategic reasons, but also because it is the larger area. It constitutes 1/5 of the occupied West Bank. There are currently more than 700,000 Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank, all of them there illegally under international law. And this kind of has been echoed by both Israeli ministers and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was saying last week at the World Economic Forum that Israel is fundamentally interested in the West Bank. And as part of signing the coalition between the right-wing section of the Israeli government and the ruling Likud party, which Netanyahu is part of, annexation of the occupied West Bank was a primary aspect of that agreement. And so what that includes is allocating more money for outposts, creating those facts on the ground by forcibly displacing herding communities and Palestinians from their homes in more strategic areas like Hebron, and then putting as much as they can into creating those facts on the ground. So 2024 was kind of the year that Israel started implementing those changes that they openly declared was part of the policy for establishing the Israeli coalition in 2022. So for the why now question, I believe that's largely why. Gaza has some of the most formidable armed resistance in historic Palestine, but the West Bank is very strategically and ideologically and even religiously important for Israeli settlers. And it's the area that has been already partitioned time and time again. The settlements are expanded into so many different areas, and you see Palestinians corralled into these Bantustans and surrounded by Jewish-only roads that connect the settlements into present-day Israel and makes it much easier for settlers to go back and forth. And so the West Bank has always been kind of the focus for expansion of settlements and expansion of Israel into those areas. And that's precisely why also the armed resistance there has been much, I don't want to say weaker, but it's hard to build resistance when they're under the constant surveillance and eye of the Israeli military. I mean, daily raids in the occupied West Bank have been kind of the norm, for decades, but they have just looked different. I mean, in 10 years ago, you would say that you would see these daily raids. Israeli forces would arrest dozens of Palestinians. They would conduct killings, or sometimes they would accompany Israeli settlers into certain areas like Nablus, for example, in the northern West Bank. But the last few years, especially with this extreme right-wing coalition, it's really been a project of colonization.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're recording this, the exchanges have stopped because Israel has not allowed aid to go into Gaza, which is part of the ceasefire agreement. And so Hamas announced that it would not be going through with one of the exchanges. And I can't help but also note that hundreds of people have been arrested, hundreds of Palestinians have been arrested in the West Bank. And that's obviously not part of any exchange, right? Because we're only talking about we're only talking about the predetermined agreement that happened with the ceasefire on January 19th. So how many people have been sucked up into now Israel's prison system, and what does that look like? I mean, in terms of these forced disappearances of people, and is there any kind of like what how do people go about getting their loved ones back in this kind of system?
That's a very good question. I mean, before October 7th, Israel had about, I think it was, the number was a bit over 5,000 Palestinian prisoners in its dungeons. And the question of Palestinian imprisonment is a very central and important question to the Palestinian struggle against Israel's colonization, because Israel arrests Palestinians arbitrarily. Anything can get a Palestinian arrested. It can be throwing a rock, publishing a Facebook post, being part of a political organization that does not necessarily have a military wing. And since October 7th, the number of of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails has exceeded 10,000 Palestinians. That's nearly double the number that was the case before October 7th. And you can see this all over Israeli media. Generals, while they talk to, not necessarily generals, but senior Israeli officers in the army, almost openly talking about how they would be used as bargaining chips in future exchanges with Hamas. And so in the first few waves of the prisoner exchange between Israel and Hamas, you could look at the list of Palestinian prisoners getting released, and almost all of them, especially in the first few waves, almost all of them were arrested after October 7th. And Israel doesn't necessarily need to charge anyone with anything in order to arrest them. There is this policy that Israel kind of inherited from British colonial rule of Palestine called administrative detention. And this is the act of holding Palestinian prisoners without charge or trial in Israeli jails. They are not allowed to see evidence against them. They are not even permitted to know why they are being held. Even their lawyers are not allowed to know those things. And they are held for indefinite periods of time. Sometimes, I mean, the extent of the order is 6 months, but it can be renewed indefinitely. Some people have spent years under administrative detention in Israeli jails. And so the number of Palestinian children getting imprisoned under administrative detention also skyrocketed since October 7th. And Israel usually targets known figures, especially figures who are purported to be part of political groups. And Israel considers virtually any Palestinian political organization a terrorist group. So being any part of any kind of group, even if they don't have an armed wing, is considered criminal under Israeli law. And so this has been the case with Palestinian prisoners. Since October 7th, the extent of the torture that Palestinian prisoners had to go through, were subjected to by their Israeli jailers and Israeli authorities, has just been unspeakable. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will have heard of the Sde Teiman camp. This was formerly an Israeli military, what do you call it, an Israeli military outpost or Israeli military base that was turned into a sorting detention center for Palestinians. A lot of us have seen those pictures that emerged from the camp, where Palestinians were being held blindfolded in stress positions. They were not allowed to move. They were rarely fed, even when they are receiving whatever nonsense medical attention. They are receiving it blindfolded without even knowing who is giving it to them. It was even called an internship paradise for so-called personnel who are not even appropriately trained to give medical attention. And in the worst case scenarios, Palestinians were tortured, beaten, and in some cases were sexually assaulted and raped by their Israeli captors. One incident was even filmed on camera through surveillance cameras in that camp, and the jailer who was responsible for the mob who carried out this assault was lauded as a hero on Israeli national television. I mean, he would appear on Israeli national television masked at first, and then he very proudly published a video of him unveiling his face and very proudly coming out as the leader of the mob who assaulted that Palestinian prisoner. So so this is what Palestinian prisoners are going through under Israeli arrest. And if the pictures of the footage of the Palestinian prisoners getting released from the prisons in those exchanges are any indication, they are malnourished. They receive very little to no medical attention. The situation is just absolutely unconscionable in those prisons. And it's very clear that Israel uses those arrests, which are carried out under very flimsy grounds, if there are any grounds at all, to use Palestinians in those exchanges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, it's absolutely horrifying the visuals that have been shared. I mean, it's the first live streamed genocide that I'm aware of, and the first live streamed ethnic cleansing that we're seeing in the West Bank as well. So we can't say that we didn't know. And I'm curious also in terms of in terms of collaborators, because this is something that we spoke to Nora Barrows-Friedman about briefly when we had her on the show, but hoping you might be able to give some more depth and context, because the Palestinian Authority is something that I think is largely not, I mean, it's not something that the corporate media in the US ever talk about, and it's not something that people are really familiar with. And if they hear it, it sounds like it's Palestinian, right? And I was wondering if you could talk about how the Palestinian Authority very sadistically and very grotesquely works with Israeli forces to oppress and carry out Israel's plans for Palestinians.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, the Palestinian Authority was created as part of the Oslo Accords, which I mentioned earlier in the 1990s. From the day it was created, from its very first inception, the Palestinian Authority was created as a collaborative body that gives the illusion that Palestinians have this like sort of representation or authority or independence. But in reality, it's a collaborative body that exists in order to give what they call security coordination with Israel. Security coordination means that everything that the Palestinian Authority does in the occupied West Bank serves Israel's interests. So they have a I wouldn't call it an army. It's like a they have personnel, forces, soldiers, whatever you call them. They're largely Israel's foot soldiers. They exist in order to suppress Palestinian opposition to the occupation, to quell any form of resistance, armed or not, and they exist to help Israel maintain its occupation in the West Bank while promoting this illusion of Palestinian autonomy and representation. One thing that's very important to understand, which I don't think a lot of people get about the Palestinian Authority, is that they're not allowed to touch the hair on an Israeli settler's head, even if they kill a Palestinian. The Palestinian Authority exists only to kill, injure, and arrest other Palestinians. And so they, in fact, protect the Israeli settlers because they can only enter certain areas in the West Bank with Israel's approval and coordination. In December, the Palestinian Authority carried out just an unbelievably deadly and massive assault on the Jenin refugee camp that throughout which 14 Palestinians were killed. Many others were injured. There was massive destruction. this operation in particular, the timing of it, and the way that the Palestinian Authority framed it for its Israeli and American partners, is that it was there to quell the armed resistance and to basically impress and demonstrate its loyalty and collaboration to the incoming US president, as well as its Israeli partners. I mean, they even requested, so any kind of weapons that the Palestinian Authority receives, it receives from the Europeans, it receives from the United States, and all of that has to be greenlit by Israel. And so apparently the Palestinian Authority submitted a list of weapons that it needed to the United States, and the US even sent this request to be approved by the Israelis in order for them to receive a set of weapons which they would only be using against other Palestinians. This operation, which started in early January and concluded in started in early December and concluded in early January, was precisely what paved the way for the Israelis to start and launch and conduct this operation, which started on January 21st. The Israelis even were telling media, this is a lot of like unnamed sources, senior officials, etc., that they were very impressed by the Palestinian Authority's determination in the Jenin refugee camp. They were not expecting for the Palestinian Authority to be this severe, even after it witnessed what Israel had done in Gaza, to go into the West Bank with this deadliness and severity. It's a completely shameless, traitorous regime. I mean, traitors are considered in every culture, in every resistance movement. It's the highest form of treason against one's country to be a collaborator with the enemies and the occupiers and the colonizers of your country. And the Palestinian Authority represents just that. They exist in order to protect and advance Israel's interests. Whatever support they enjoy from Palestinians are probably on their payroll, and they have no other role other than to advance Israeli ambitions. And one of the reasons that Israel started this operation in Jenin is because the Palestinian Authority was not even very successful. And while they get criticized from Israel's right-wing coalition, who don't even want this collaborative body to exist just because it's Palestinian, it's largely very important and serves a very important role for Israelis. And this is why the Palestinian martyr and writer Bassel al-Araj wrote a very excellent piece as part of his book, I Found My Answers, about how the first step in dissolving the military occupation in the West Bank is dismantling the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, I mean, and history is rife with these kind of examples of people from the oppressed community going along with the occupier or the oppressor in hopes that they will be spared, and only to realize at the end that the whole objective of the occupier and the oppressor is to eradicate all of the people, even those who collaborate with them. So the Palestinian Authority is not safe, as you pointed out. And I want to kind of, in the time that we have left, I also want to kind of zoom out a little bit here, because there's been some conversations like Egypt is saying, no, you can't just hand us, 1.8 million Palestinians. That's not how this works. What kind of regional pushback? I know that there's a very difficult, might not be the right word, but a difficult history in terms of regional support for Palestine. But is there any kind of regional pushback with saying that, like, no, this is it's not something that we are going to accept. You can't just pour these refugees into our nations. Anything like that you're seeing, or how are other places in the region responding to this uptick in violence?
Yeah, I mean, whatever Jordan and Egypt oppose or don't oppose, 15 months of relentless Israeli bombing in Gaza has not managed to convince Palestinians to leave the territory. And if Trump and Israel want to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza, they have the armed resistance which defeated Israel in Gaza and forced them to negotiate with the very organization that they vowed to destroy. They will have to go through them first. So that's what I'll say about any sorts of plan for moving Palestinians from their land. This has been the same exact goal that we've seen over the past nearly 80 years. And the Palestinians, their connection to the land and their insistence on staying. I mean, those images and videos of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians marching from Gaza's southern area into the northern area, even as you see everything around them in that landscape completely destroyed, is one testament to Palestinian determination to stay on their land. Palestinians enjoy incredible support from regional allies. This includes the resistance in Lebanon, the resistance in Iraq, the resistance in Yemen, and of course Iran. But other countries in the region, not a single Arab state have suspended their diplomatic relations with Israel throughout 15 months of genocide. So it's hard to say how Jordan and Egypt will respond, especially given that Jordan has repeatedly said that its red line is any kind of attempt of pushing Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan. But one thing is for sure, none of these plans always go as expected and may prove as short-lived and ill-fated as the it was I think $230 million pier that the United States built off of Gaza's coast. Regardless of those discrete objectives, the pier partially drifted ashore, and many of those plans will similarly drift ashore because Palestinians are very resilient and the armed resistance is very resilient, and they were able to blow a very massive and embarrassing defeat for Israel. I mean, this is one of the most capable and armed and funded armies in the world, and a guerrilla group that emerged under unbelievable conditions, constant surveillance, a siege that lasted 16 years in a flat area, the size of, I mean, the longest like length in Gaza is less than a full marathon, and they were able to emerge out of that area and defeat the army that said they would destroy them. That's a testament as to what Palestinians will or will not do. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it is amazing to have, I mean, Israel has the backing of the largest empire the world has ever seen, and yet the world, I mean, the US empire is no stranger to defeat. I mean, look at Vietnam, look at Iraq, Afghanistan. The United States continuously underestimates the people that it attempts to trample over, and the Palestinians are certainly no different. And I mean, just when you were talking about the people marching back, there were so many Israeli media outlets saying like, oh, well, what do they have to go back to? And all these Palestinians being like, well, settler, you don't get it because all you have are the buildings that are that they're shallow. It's not, you have no depth of connection to this place. Of course you don't get it. And that's why you won't win, because you don't understand fundamentally the idea of a connection to place this deep. And so Tamara, it certainly is no, it's not a nice outlook, but I think what you just shared there is that light and that resilience is definitely something that keeps coming up regardless. And Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing this context and this information and doing the work that you do. Folks can check out the work on Electronic Intifada. We cover it pretty frequently, electronicintifada.net. Tamara, is there anywhere else that you'd like to tell folks to keep an eye on for information on the West Bank?
I mean, I have an incoming piece. I think we're going to publish it today that contextualizes this within the larger settlement expansion in the West Bank and why the West Bank is of such importance for Israel. So that's one thing people can read. And thank you very much, Eleanor, for having me on your show and this lovely podcast. And I hope to talk to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Tamara. I appreciate it.
Thank you.